So during our session today, we're going to spend most of our time talking with Heidi about Alaska Airlines' specific path to pay equity disclosure. But just to kind of help set the context, I wanted to start talking a little bit about why pay equity is top of mind for many employers and why some organizations, like Alaska Airlines, have decided to share their pay equity results in either their sustainability or ESG reporting. So first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why is pay equity top of mind? And in my view, the reasons why pay equity is top of mind are really ever growing. When I first started doing work with companies to help them address pay equity, and this was almost 25 years ago now, um, really what I heard about was OFCCP compliance. That's really what I heard about most often. And at that time, pay equity was really more of a compliance exercise. It was predominantly handled by a company's legal team. HR might know about the work, but as a general rule, they were not that deeply involved in the work. That might sound surprising to you now, but that was really the case, 20, 25 years ago. But since then, we've seen a host of legislation focusing specifically on pay equity. So we had legislation like the 2009 Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. We had salary history bans in more than 20 states in the US. We now have gender pay gap reporting in more than 50 jurisdictions around the world. And of course, for those of us in the US, we are quite familiar with the new pay transparency laws. And by my last count, don't quote me on this, by my last count, I think there's 10 states that currently either have some sort of pay transparency law or one that will be going into effect. And then, of course, there's the monumental EU pay transparency directive. So there's just been a host of reporting requirements and legislation that have kind of brought us to the point where we are now. But then along with this legislation, we also started to see considerable investor pressure and shareholder activism, I would say about a decade ago. And the most notable example of this is Arjuna Capital. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Arjuna Capital, it's an activist investor firm, and it basically started filing shareholder proposals back in 2014. And these proposals asked the targeted company to conduct a pay equity analysis and share the results publicly. And you might not be surprised to learn that there was a lot of pushback when Arjuna Capital first started with these shareholder proposals. They got a lot of pushback from companies. But eventually, many relented and actually started sharing their pay equity results. And Arjuna Capital now releases an annual racial and gender pay scorecard and grades select companies using an A through F grading system. And so because of this shareholder activism, companies that have been targeted with proposals certainly became more focused on proactively addressing pay equity, as well as companies hoping to avoid being targeted with a proposal. So we start seeing more and more reasons why organizations are thinking about pay equity. And then as more companies start sharing their pay equity results publicly, there's some peer pressure there, right? So peer companies are starting to feel pressure to report as well. And we've seen this most notably in the financial services and technology industries, but it's really spreading across industries. And for companies that are in industries with greater pay transparency around pay equity, if a company chooses not to share this information, it might raise questions about the company's lack of transparency. And that could potentially have some, reputational damage for an organization. And then lastly, and I think this is a pretty notable sort of cultural shift, I do think there's been a real shift toward greater transparency just more broadly in the way we live. People entering the workforce now have very different expectations about pay transparency. When I first entered the workforce, it would never have occurred to me to ask an employer about what the pay range is for this role. And I think most of us know people who are entering the workforce now, and they are, of course, saying, well, I'm not going to even apply for a role if I don't have that information. So, where we've moved into this world where employers should really expect employees to be sharing information about compensation with their colleagues, friends, and family. So if you think your employees are not talking with others about their pay, they are. And they also expect you to give them information about compensation. So these are kind of the host of reasons why pay equity is top of mind for organizations. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So, one thing and if you've ever attended one of my webinars, you might have heard this before, but I always think it's important to kind of explain what we even mean by pay equity, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion about what are we talking about when we talk about pay equity. For example, we hear a lot about pay equity in the media. And so here are some quotes that I pulled, and I'll just read these off to you. Women working full-time and year-round are paid an average of 84 cents for every dollar paid to men. Black women working full-time year-round are paid 69 cents, and all earners, including part-time and seasonal, are paid 66 cents for every dollar paid to non-Hispanic white men. We conducted an analysis focusing on a number of factors, including job function, job level, and geography. We found that women are paid on average 99% of what men are paid, and minorities are paid on average 99% of what non-minorities are paid. And then lastly, our objective is that employees performing comparable tasks are paid similarly, with any differences in pay explained by legitimate job-related factors. So all of these quotes are talking about pay, but they're not all talking about pay equity. So if we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by pay equity. So, most people are familiar with what I'm calling the raw pay gap. And the raw pay gap simply tells us how average or median pay differs by demographic group. And for example, the UK Gender Pay Gap report, if you're familiar with that legislation, it requires companies with 250 or more employees to report the median pay of women compared to the median pay of men. So this is what we think of as the raw pay gap. And kind of at a conceptual level, we can look at the raw pay gap and break it down into two different components. The first is what I like to call the explained part of the raw pay gap. And obviously, there's also an unexplained part as well. But when we talk about the explained part, so this is really the part of the raw pay gap that reflects the extent to which pay differs by demographic group due to differences in what we like to call compensable factors. So these are factors like occupation, career level, education, experience. So we think of these as legitimate reasons why people would be paid differently. So we don't expect people to be paid the same, but we expect to be able to explain why people are paid differently using legitimate compensable factors. And if you look at just the typical organization, the largest part of the explained pay gap is generally due to representation differences across career levels. So when we look at organizations, we often find that men and white employees are disproportionately represented in higher career levels that pay more, and women and people of color are disproportionately represented in lower career levels that pay less. And what's interesting is that the way you address the explained part of the pay gap is really quite different than the way you address a pay equity gap. So explained pay gaps are really best addressed through career and opportunity equity policies. And these are policies that ensure employees are provided with equitable access to career advancement, and so career development. So addressing the explained part of the pay gap is really about how do we get women and people of color into higher career levels that have higher pay opportunities associated with them. Now, obviously, that's a huge effort in addressing the explained pay gap, addressing these, what we like to think of as opportunity inequities. And that's obviously very important, but that's also not the focus of pay equity per se. So the second component of that raw pay gap is what we call the unexplained pay gap. And not surprisingly, this is the remaining part of the raw pay gap that cannot be explained by those legitimate compensable factors, and may be due to what we think of as pay inequities based on demographic characteristics. So it could be gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, a variety of different demographic characteristics that you can look at. And when we talk about unexplained pay gaps, you may also hear this referred to as the adjusted pay gap or the controlled pay gap. But basically what it's saying is that after we've accounted for legitimate factors that drive pay differences, we see some remaining pay gap that appears to be related to some demographic characteristic. And the unexplained pay gap, the way you address that is by conducting a pay equity analysis. And if needed, you can adjust the compensation of specific individuals who are identified as part of an underpaid demographic class. So with that, let's return to our quotes. So we can go to the next slide. There we go. So just want to revisit these very quickly. So as I mentioned earlier, these are all talking about pay, but they're not all talking about pay equity. So the first two quotes, women working full-time are paid an average of 84 cents for every dollar, and Black women working full-time are paid 69 cents. These are talking about the raw pay gap, right? So this is basically looking at the average pay of women relative to the average pay of men, or the average pay of Black women relative to the average pay of white men. Whereas the second two quotes are talking about pay equity. And you can tell because they make specific references to the analysis that they've run. It says, we conducted an analysis, we looked at a number of factors, and by factors, they mean legitimate compensable factors like job function, job level, geography. And once they've done that, here's where they're talking about that unexplained pay gap. And they find that in this case, on average, women are paid 99% of what men are paid. So the unexplained pay gap is a much, much smaller percent relative to our raw pay gaps. And then lastly, our last quote here is also talking about pay equity, because again, it's making specific reference to saying we've accounted for legitimate job-related factors. So it's just important to understand when you're reading, the newspaper or an article, that you really understand the difference between the raw pay gap and a pay equity gap, because they are quite different in terms of the way you go about addressing them. And of course, our focus today is really more on pay equity. So I think we can move to the next slide. Okay. So, this is just an illustration. And again, these are just completely fictitious numbers, just an illustration of the pay gaps that we just covered. So in this hypothetical example, men are paid $100,000 on average, and women are paid $80,000 on average. So in this hypothetical example, the raw pay gap is $20,000 or 20%. So this is where we would say women earn 80 cents for every dollar a man earns. Now, in this hypothetical example, we've been able to measure the explained part of the raw pay gap, and we've measured it at $15,000. So in this hypothetical example, the explained pay gap is the primary driver of the raw pay gap, with the remaining $5,000 left unexplained. And the primary purpose of doing a pay equity analysis is really to measure the organization's unexplained pay gap, and then, if needed, make pay adjustments to close that gap. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, great. So I wanted to share here how we actually go about measuring, because in the last example, I said, well, we measured the unexplained pay gap at 5,000 and the explained pay gap at 15,000. Well, how do we actually do that? So to do that, during a pay equity analysis, we measure the unexplained pay gap using something called multiple regression. And this is an actual example from a Glassdoor report. It's a little old now. It's about 5 years old, but it's actually a really interesting study. So if you have a chance, you might want to just take a look at it. Basically, they, of course, we're all familiar with Glassdoor. They collect information from people like us about our role, about our compensation, and they ask for a bunch of information, and they collect that. And then, of course, they share that with us, when we want to know how much a particular organization, compensates people. But they also can use that data. They can actually take that data and analyze it. And this is what they did about 5 years ago. And basically, I think this is a very good illustration of how you use multiple regression to measure your pay equity gaps. So here we're looking at the US gender pay gap, and this is focusing just on base pay. So in this example, what we're calling no controls, so over on the left-hand side where it says no controls, the no controls is basically the raw pay gap. So in this case, it's measured at 21.4%. So when we simply look at the raw pay gap between women and men, we see women are paid 21.4% less than men. But we're not accounting for any legitimate factors that might explain those pay differences. But then what they do is they start to control for those relevant compensable factors that they have available to them. They don't have perfect data, but they have pretty good data. So the first thing they do is they say, well, what happens if we account for things like age and education and years of experience? So that's the second column that you see there. And so you see that when they add that information to their analysis and take that into account, you'll see that, the pay gap falls a little bit. Doesn't fall by very much, but it falls a little bit. And then when they continue to add controls for industry and occupation, location, year, and company size, that's when you really start to see a decline in that gender pay gap. And that's because these are factors that are heavily influencing that raw pay gap. As I mentioned earlier, things like representation differences. Well, when you look in the aggregate, we often see a lot of occupational and industry segregation, where certain occupations tend to be overly represented, have overrepresentation of men and, for example, white individuals, and those are higher paying occupations and industries relative to the industries and occupations where women tend to be concentrated. And so once we account for industry, occupation, location, and company size, we see that that explains a fairly large portion of that raw pay gap. And so we see that gender pay gap falling to 7.6%. Then they add company-specific controls, and it falls further to 6.3%. And then lastly, they add job titles. So they have information from individuals on their job titles. And so this pretty much exhausts their legitimate compensable factors, and they're left with a gender pay gap of about 4.9%. So this sort of final figure represents what we like to think of as kind of an apples to apples comparison, that we've accounted for as many of the legitimate compensable factors as we are able to, and we have this remaining 4.9% gap that appears to be related to gender. So in this case, if we wanted to address this, we may actually have to make some adjustments to individual employees so we could address this unexplained pay gap. So this is similar to what an organization would do when they do a pay equity analysis. So if we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. So this is the last thing we'll cover before we start chatting with Heidi. But I did want to do a quick review of kind of the key process steps in doing a pay equity review. And so the first step is really around data preparation, data collection and preparation. So you start by collecting data on the factors that you would expect to influence pay based on your individual company's pay philosophy. So things, for example, like tenure or job function or time in role, career level, performance rating, location. So you want to have a collection of information based on those compensable factors, those legitimate compensable factors. And then you also, of course, want to collect information on the measures of pay that you would like to examine. So, for example, maybe you're looking just at base pay. So you want to make sure you're collecting base pay information as well for the individuals in the analysis. And then lastly, of course, you want to capture the demographic characteristics you'd like to examine. So, for example, that could be gender, it could be race or ethnicity, it could be disability status, or really any other demographic characteristic that where you have some interest in understanding if there's a relationship between that demographic factor and compensation. So once you've collected your data, the next is what we call pay analysis group formation. So really, to better measure pay disparities, we highly recommend segmenting your workforce. And we call these segments pay analysis groups. You might call them something different. But conceptually, it's really just a way of separating your workforce into different groups for comparison purposes. And then once you've created these segments, you would then run a separate regression analysis for each of your pay analysis groups. And there's a few things to think about as you develop your pay analysis groups. So things including differences in pay philosophy and pay practices, differences in the nature of work that's being done, as well as geographic boundaries. And ultimately, when you're creating your pay analysis groups, you really want to balance two things. On the one hand, you want to differentiate your workforce. So you want to create many different segments, because that allows you to really capture kind of the unique pay practices associated with different parts of your workforce. But on the other hand, you might need to do some pooling to have sufficient statistical power. So there's always this balancing act between differentiating your workforce and pooling your workforce to create more statistical power. But once you've done that and created your pay analysis groups, then you can move on to the regression modeling. And this is very similar to the Glassdoor example that I shared with you, where you'll run an analysis that includes all of those legitimate compensable factors in your model, as well as the demographic factors that you're interested in examining. And once you've run that analysis, then you move on to what we call the assessment phase. So as part of this phase, here you'll flag the groups with pay disparities. So you're going to be looking in particular, are there particular pay analysis groups where your demographic factors, whether that's gender or race or ethnicity or another demographic characteristic, are statistically related to pay. And that is, again, after you've accounted for the legitimate drivers of pay differences. So after you've created that apples to apples comparison, do we see a statistical relationship between demographic characteristics and compensation? And then the last phase is remediation. And so in this phase, if you've identified any groups that flagged as having, statistically meaningful pay disparities, here you'll identify specific individuals that might require an adjustment, and you'll probably review those individuals and then ultimately do some remediation on specific individuals that you believe require a pay adjustment to address the pay disparities that have been identified. So with that, we can move to the next slide. All right. So, and we've all seen that the norm is really quickly shifting toward greater pay transparency. And now, obviously, every company has to decide what information they want to share about their pay and their pay practices. So what we're going to be hearing from Heidi is really about Alaska Airlines' journey, and your journey might look quite different from this. But it's important to hear about the details of one organization's journey, because that could actually help inform your own as well. So with that, we're now going to have this great conversation with Heidi. And Heidi, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so wonderful to have you. All right. So with that, if you're okay, Heidi, I'll just get started with some questions. Are you there, Heidi?
Uh-oh. There we go. I don't know what
There you
happened.
go.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. That's fine. Well, first off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the rationale and decision making around disclosure. So kind of what do you think motivated Alaska Airlines to decide to include pay equity results in your sustainability report?
Sure. I think a lot of sort of what you talked about already like resonated a lot with some of the things that helped us decide what to do. We very strongly believe in pay transparency and pay equity. We think that those two efforts are really key towards building trust with our people and encouraging diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as you think about DEI, it's a really important initiative to have in thinking about diversity within your workforce. But the equity piece of DEI is more than just workforce equity. It's really, we sort of see the pay equity piece folding into that. So if you really want to think about DEI holistically, you need to be thinking not only just about equity in your workforce, but also equity in how you pay people. So to us, we felt like those two things went hand in hand, and we were already publishing information about our DEI efforts in our sustainability report. And it made a lot of sense to say, like, that's not all. There's more to it than just that. So let's talk more and get to a place where we can actually start to talk about the whole DEI kind of profile and look at it from a pay perspective too. So
Yeah, no, that's a great point that if you're already talking about DEI, to not talk about pay equity seems like maybe you're kind of it seems like it's something's
yeah,
missing.
you're missing a little bit of it. Yeah, because it's not just about the people, it's how you're treating those people while they're
Yeah,
there, right? It's the
absolutely.
inclusion, but it's also how you pay them, because how you pay them makes them feel a certain way
Oh,
and
of
you
course, yes.
want
I
them
mean, yes.
to feel included.
Yeah. I mean,
So to me,
we yeah, I like the idea that that people being paid fairly, for example, if they feel they're paid fairly, it makes them feel like they belong and it makes
yes,
them feel engaged and
yes,
that there's it's not it's an important part not just of equity but of
yeah,
inclusion,
yep,
I think, as
yeah,
well. No, that's a great point.
yeah.
So was there any kind of internal debate or any hesitation about disclosing this? It's not a small decision.
It's not a small decision. And when you talk about, I mean, I think if we think about, typically we talk about pay, people are like, oh my gosh, it's pay. We can't talk about pay. But that's not where things are headed, right? We're headed in a direction where we need to become more comfortable talking about pay. You mentioned that. People are talking about pay. We have to get comfortable that as people are, especially newer, younger generations are entering the workforce, what do they want? They want to apply to an organization that publishes their salary ranges. Pay transparency is super important, right? And so when it comes to publishing pay equity, what was there some hesitation about doing it? Absolutely. It's scary stuff, right? When you've never done it before, anything that you've never done feels a little bit daunting to begin with. And it was a little bit, I would say, scary. We did have hesitation. We had hesitation. We had some excitement from some people. I was like all in, right? I'm like, we're doing this. This is so important to me. And we had other people saying, hold on, we're excited too, but let's pause and think about this. Um, we, you know, I think it's hard because in the beginning you're like, what are we going to publish? And there's fear around what numbers are we going to publish and how are we going to talk about it? How are our employees going to perceive it? How are shareholders, the public, right? All of those people are potential candidates. Any of those people are potential candidates. So it's kind of comes full circle when you think about the potential impact it could have. Um, so we were kind of thinking about how that perception can impact both company, how people perceive our company, but also internal employee engagement, right? That how do people feel about working for you related to that DEI? So there definitely was debate. There definitely was some hesitation. But I think what was super important for us is getting buy-in early on the fact that we were willing to make the financial investments to do this and do it in a way that felt right. Um, it's one thing you can run an analysis and you can publish your numbers, and they may be really, I mean, scary numbers, right? Do you want to publish those? Probably not, right? You want to do the work to be able to say we've done the work. We feel really confident in where we're at. We feel really confident in what we've done. And so I think that was super important, getting buy-in both from our leaders, from a just cultural perspective, that this is something we want to build into our culture, but also financial, right? We cannot downplay the importance of the financial investment in this work. You have to have that buy-in, and you have to be able to have the story around why this is important in order to get the financial back buy-in from your
Mhm.
finance team. So we worked really hard on both of those things, helping our leaders understand that. We actually use the Arjuna Capital report to help in some of our socialization of this work, to say, look at other companies are doing this. Look at this report. It's not perfect. We don't actually have to publish perfect numbers. I would say perfection is it's like an imprecise perfection, right? We all know that publishing pay equity is a snapshot in time.
Yeah,
It's
tomorrow
real.
it could look different.
Tomorrow it could look different. And so I think the importance here, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but I think the importance here is really about helping people understand this is a journey. It's not a snapshot. It's not a once and done. It's not a checkbox. This is about the sustainability of the work you're doing. It's about the maintenance of all of this work, and it's not just about publishing. So getting people to understand what the foundation of the things that come behind it, and not just saying, we're just going to go out and publish a number and we checked our box and we're done, right? So I think kind of getting all of those things, your kind of housekeeping in place before you say we're going to publish is really important, really important. So
So how did you kind of know that you were ready to disclose?
how did we know we were ready?
Yeah.
So I think this goes a little bit to the journey that we have embarked on. And this has been a multi-year journey. I would say it's taken us 4 to 5 years to get here. We
And that's
decided,
good to know. So people listening, you
yeah,
know, they might be heartened by that. Okay, this is not something that can happen overnight.
I mean, I suppose it could. That's possible. That's possible. For us, it took years. It was years of setting foundational elements in place to be able to do this work. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I can talk about that a little bit. So 4 or 5 years ago, I don't exactly remember the starting date, could have been a little bit longer. We decided we didn't really have a career architecture in place. And we decided that we wanted to actually set up a better pipeline, thinking about talent and also diversity, equity, inclusion, and how do we help our employees understand what their career could look like, what paths can look like. So we decided to create a career architecture. We call it our career framework, to help set the foundation for how people can grow their careers in our company. We also then, and that took years. That alone took years to develop and implement and put into place and communicate and educate on. And then we said we also need new salary structures that can support this new framework, because the salary structures we had just didn't work well. They didn't partner well with that. And so we redesigned our entire compensation structure. We came up with a new compensation philosophy that supported both these new structures and the career framework that they partner super well with. And so we put into place new salary structures. Well, as you can imagine, people in the old structure going into the new structure it's not like this perfect one-to-one. If it was, you wouldn't have new structures, right? You'd have exactly the same thing. And so we, again, had amazing financial support to be able to, over time, again, this is not something that you can probably do overnight. The financial investment can be very
Mhm.
large. And so we took our time over a couple years and made investments in our people. We came up with a philosophy around what it meant for how we wanted people to sit within those salary structures based on their career, and what experience they bring, what education they bring to their roles. And so we came up with a philosophy around that. And then we invested money over time to kind of what we called sort of right size people within those ranges, what we felt like was right sizing, right? We still don't know exactly if we've got this right. So that's where Trusaic came in and helped us. We partnered with Trusaic, and they really helped us with trying to understand how the pay equity analysis, we can do all the work behind the scenes that we want to think we have it right, but do we have it right? And so now that we've done all this work, we brought in Trusaic and they partnered with us, and they helped us run a pay equity analysis that supported our new career architecture, that supported our new pay ranges, that supported our new pay philosophy, and our idea around how we think people should progress through ranges, and helped us with that pay equity analysis. I don't even remember what the question was, but I was
No, no,
asking
no,
you
no,
about
that's
the
no, that's
journey.
fine. Well, that's fine. But I think what I like to remind people of is that a pay equity analysis is going to be of much higher quality if you have like those foundational pieces in place, right? A good,
Yes.
strong, well thought out career architecture with people mapped to the right roles. I
Hmm.
can't tell you how many times I've done an analysis where I've worked with a client and they say, yeah, but people doing that job, I mean, I know that's the job they're in, but they're really not in that job. They're in a different job, but we didn't want to create a new job. So now they're called that, but they're really doing something else. And so you've
Hmm.
got people in the same job doing very different things, or people
Hmm.
in different jobs doing the same things. And it's like, well, of
Hmm.
course, you hate to be the bearer of bad news, but of course the quality of the pay equity analysis is going to be
Yes,
poor. You're not going to find it very actionable,
right.
because of
Yeah.
these, so it's really important. Like if you haven't already done that and you're wanting to, make progress on pay equity, the really most important part of that is making sure you have that foundation in place in terms of your pay philosophy, your pay, your salary, your pay ranges,
Hmm.
your salary scales, and all of that.
Yeah.
Getting that not perfect, it never is,
Yep.
but getting it in the right, direction is, I think,
Yep.
an important foundational step to doing an effective pay equity analysis.
Yeah.
So,
And we did have earlier in the process, we had um I'll specifically say like our leader of our HR team said, what would it take for us to publish pay equity numbers? I hear other companies are doing this. We should do it too. And I said, we are not ready. We are not ready for this. This is such important work. This is such, in my opinion, influential work to who we are as a company and how we
mhm.
want to show up to our employees, to the public. And we want to be really thoughtful and really careful about how we do this so that we don't stumble when we publish and we're not ready to like talk
Yeah,
about it or answer it, right?
yeah. So you talked about trying, getting agreement to do this. Um, what stakeholders were kind of involved in the decision? Like, who did you have to involve to make this happen?
Yeah. Um, we started within our HR team. I think that's sort of where the catalyst of this work started. I'm really passionate about it. And I have leaders up through our HR team who are also very passionate about it. Our DEI leaders very passionate about it. And so I think because we had some really amazing support like internally on our HR team, that made this journey a little bit easier for us because we were all aligned that this is really important and we want to get there. Um, so the next step obviously is it's not just our decision, right? We need our senior leaders to get involved and get buy-in. And like I said, we knew that this would take a financial investment. And so we it was really important for us to get our finance team on board with this because we could have every single other stakeholder in the process ready and willing and excited. And if finance is like, but we can't, we're not ready right now, we don't have the money to do this, we didn't feel like we could do it, right? And so I think going in early to get finances buy-in, to say we're ready to make an investment. We also understand you've given us the business case. We understand why this is important. We understand the benefits of doing it, both for employees, for the company, for um, all those things. And so getting finances involvement and also getting our, we call them our EC, our executive committee, um, kind of engaged and bought in to the idea, and I sort of think of it as like the bigger idea. It's the DEI idea. We have our leaders already engaged in, again, the workforce DEI efforts. And so it's sort of explaining to them, how do you round out the profile of DEI? It's not just the people in the jobs, it's the rest of how they feel about that. And so going to them and sort of explaining why this work is important. Um, we have we are super fortunate to have a really amazing culture at our company, that values caring for our employees. That's like care is one of our values. Like caring for our people and doing the right thing are our values. And so it felt really aligned to that. And so I think it, because we had already been publishing our DEI, our kind of workforce DEI metrics, it made sense that this could be the next step. And so we really at that point had their buy-in both from a financial perspective and also just like, yeah, this is the right thing. This does align with who we want to be. So
Yeah. So in terms of the actual kind of disclosure, how did you decide what specific information you wanted to disclose in
yep.
the report?
Yeah. I think we sort of felt like our first time out, we want to keep it simple. Um, I was really excited. One of the things that Trusaic does well is the idea of the intersectionality of gender and race, and not just race and
Mhm.
gender separately, right? So I was really excited about that. But I think we wanted to be a little bit more on the cautious side on how we wanted to go out for the first time, right? I think we wanted for sure to disclose gender and race numbers. That felt really logical for us. Um, And I think what was really interesting is we wanted to keep it really simple, do it well, and be able to talk about what we had published in a way that made sense and was easy for people to understand. We didn't want to go out with so much that they're like, whoa, this is a lot. What is this? You just went from A to Z and you didn't really bring us along on the journey. And so we felt like kind of part of our vision is a little bit of like ABC. We're going to kind of work our way to something bigger, but we really wanted to start with the basics and be able to say, we've got the basics. We can explain it well. It's easy for us to understand. If somebody were to ask, like a lot of the leaders that had buy-in in this, they can explain gender and race, right? So let's start with the basics. Let's start with what people can actually kind of absorb and understand initially. So that made sense for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is, I think that's where most organizations
Mm-hmm.
are. I think a lot of organizations are doing intersectional work in their,
Mm-hmm.
there's the pay equity work itself, right, that you're doing and that you're using to make remediation
Yes.
decisions. And many are taking that intersectional view, but then there's also the reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And the reporting is a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
One is the nitty-gritty detail of what paid changes do we need to make and et cetera, versus what is our kind of public statement
Mm-hmm.
about the work more broadly. And they're,
Yeah.
kind of different animals, right? Sort of
They are
serving
a
the
little bit.
overall same purpose, but they aren't the same
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I think maybe organizations who haven't done this don't realize, that there's the work, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's, well, how do we want to talk about that work
Mm-hmm.
publicly? And
Yeah.
those, are important conversations
They are.
to
They are.
have.
And I think especially something like this that is, I mean, I'm not trying to say it's new, but it is a newer concept. This whole idea of how to talk about pay equity. What is pay equity? It's continually changing, right? The evolution of pay equity is pretty incredible, but we want to make it consumable, right? We want to make sure that what we published, both from a numbers and the narrative, we wanted to make sure that people actually could understand what we were saying, right? We didn't want to make it so jargony that people are like,
Mhm.
what on earth are they
Or too
talking about?
statistical, or too,
Statistical,
yeah.
or yeah. So I think our approach was make this easy to understand, easy to consume, and make the numbers sort of even visually easy to just see and understand.
Yeah, no, there's
So,
an art to communicating, because these are complex concepts.
mhm.
And
Yes.
so trying to explain it to, a wide-ranging audience
Hmm.
so that everybody can understand it,
Yes.
there's definitely an art associated with how to do that effectively.
Right. And as we were talking about earlier, younger generations entering the workforce are interested in these things.
Yeah.
And there
Mhm.
are people who are going out to sustainability reports to look for this information because they want to know
Mhm.
the organization that they're going to start working at. What does it look like? Well,
Yeah.
somebody who has just graduated from college, their ability to sort of consume and understand this concept may be different than somebody who's been doing this work for a long time. So we wanted to make sure it was consumable sort of at like all levels of people entering the workforce, right?
Yeah.
And most importantly, new people entering the workforce, because that's what's
Sure.
really important.
Absolutely. And they're the ones who are really wanting this information,
Hmm.
demanding this information.
Yeah.
So how frequently do you intend to update this information? Is it going to be in every sustainability report for the foreseeable future?
Yeah. That was super important to me. Again, this was not check a box. We're one and done. I sort of said, we're doing this, we're doing this. I mean, I sort of said forever, but right, like we're doing this because this is important work. Whether I don't want to just go out and say we did it one time, we checked that box. This to me is really, we're going to do this annually in every sustainability report. Um, but I think, in terms of, I think there's something that I want to focus on here that is a little bit different than like, how often do you want to do this? We want to do it annually, but it's really not about publishing numbers annually. The work is about the maintenance that you do on a day, the actual important work is the work you do on a day-to-day basis. Reporting in your sustainability report is simply a report card of the work you're doing every single day. it's just showing people that the practices and policies and the things that we have set in place that help us hire um, and analyze pay on a day-to-day basis are set up appropriately. So that was the part of all of this that I think was most important to me as we thought about what this work means. Yes, we want to publish our numbers annually, but it's not about that. It's about how do we set up um, the maintenance, I call it the maintenance. How do we set up the maintenance for our organization so that when we do this annually, it's not a big deal. It's not this, oh my gosh, we have to do a bunch of remediation again because it's all a mess because we didn't maintain it. And so that is where I think we're actually partnering with Trusaic to do, we're kind of calling it perspectives. We're doing sort of some perspectives on a more frequent basis, and we're using it to understand, are the practices that we have on a day-to-day basis helping or hurting the pay equity that we're trying to achieve, right? And so we're actually sort of using it to test along the way to say, oh, okay, it looks like we need to do some education in this area. It looks like we need to do a little additional training in this particular area. So from my perspective, yes, absolutely, we're going to do this annually. That is simply the report card, though, of the work that's really important, which is the day-to-day stuff.
Yes,
So,
the day-to-day work, absolutely. Yes. I think that's important to keep in mind that, like you're saying, what you disclose is really the small piece of it. The actual work is the day-to-day, right? Not only
yes,
doing an analysis, but making sure that pay decisions that are made are equitable, that
yes,
are have equity in mind. And, so an ongoing, it's
it
just an
is.
ongoing work every day, because people
Mhm.
come in, they move around, your pay
Yes.
equity situation can change on a dime. And
Yes. And
so
the
it's,
the
yeah.
human factor element of that, we cannot underestimate how important the human factor element of this is, right?
Yeah.
You have a lot of different people on your recruiting or talent acquisition team, your HR business partner team, your compensation team, interpreting people's resumes, interpreting work history, and the more consistent that you can get on that work makes it so that when you do your annual report, you're like, check the box, done. That's awesome. Like, let's move
Mhm.
on. That's our report card that said that the work that we do all year round, we're doing well, because that's what's actually important, right? That every offer that you make to somebody is a fair and equitable offer. And that's part of the reason why we chose Trusaic as well to partner with, because they also have a tool. One of our requirements is we have to be able to maintain the work. And so having Salary Range Finder as a tool to help recruiters, to help business partners, to help the comp team understand what is an actual equitable salary to be able to offer to people. And that helps us maintain our pay equity throughout the year is super duper important. So,
Great. No, that's really important, right? The preventing pay inequities from creeping into
mm-hmm.
the system,
Yes,
in between your analyses, right? That's
yes,
really where the work is. And,
yes.
right, you don't want to be spending the same amount every year on
No,
remediation because it's like, what? Yeah. So you want to prevent that from happening. And ideally, then remediation is fairly modest
exactly.
if you've done the work during the year and
Mm-hmm.
made sure that, new hire offers and promotions, et cetera, were equitable. So have you seen any reaction based on this, whether it's from investors or customers or employees,
Yep.
basically from based on the disclosure?
What has been, this is the big fear, right? You're like, oh my gosh, we're going to publish. What's going to happen? And it was actually really quiet. We were really surprised. I was expecting more reaction, and we haven't really gotten a lot of reaction. Part of that, I think, though, is the fact that we were able to publish good numbers.
Yes, that's
So
true.
it does make there's not as much to react to other than, oh, that's great, right? Um, one of the things I love to do is, as I have opportunities to talk to leaders in our company or even employees in our company, I'm passionate about pay equity. I'm passionate about pay transparency. I think all of those things are super important. And so I'll often say, did you know that we published our pay equity numbers in our sustainability report? Have you seen them? A lot of times people will say, oh yeah, I did notice that. Yeah, they're great. Or no, I didn't. And I'll tell them and they'll be like, that's awesome. And so I think in general, the reactions have been positive because we did all of that foundational work and had
Mm-hmm.
buy-in and were able to do all of that so that the numbers we published were good numbers. Our goal, I think this is important, publishing numbers, in my opinion, is more important than perfection. It's that the idea of perfection just seems so artificial
Sure.
because tomorrow, the decision you make tomorrow can impact that, right? And so I think our numbers are not one to one, but that's okay because that's maybe not totally reality. Are they really, really good and really, really close? Absolutely. But I think I didn't want us to be afraid
Mm-hmm.
of the reaction because some of the fear ahead of time is what if it's not one to one? What if it's not this perfect one to one? And I said, that's okay. That's okay. That just means that we have more work to do. We have more progress. We're going to keep doing this and we're
Mm-hmm.
going to keep working at it. And our goal is to get really good, right? Our goal is to get really good. It just seems because there's so many influencing factors, it does seem hard to think that one to one is going to be perfect every single day of the year, right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So, um, do you see pay equity disclosures becoming kind of a standard part of sustainability reporting for the airline industry more broadly?
I hope so. I hope so. There are a few other airlines that do it. We do have a chance to meet with other airlines through kind of forums that we have. And I love talking about it. I get really excited about it. I try to encourage them to do it because I do think it's important. I think it's important as an industry for us to do this. And so I'm hopeful that this does become something that is more prevalent within all of our airline peer groups.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And I think you've already talked a little bit. Do you see that your disclosure, do you see that as kind of a competitive advantage for you? Yeah.
I do. I do. Absolutely. I think again, thinking about new people entering the workforce, right? We're passionate about pay transparency. We post pay ranges everywhere in all locations, not just where we're required to. And that our pay transparency efforts partnered with having numbers in our disclosure um, are helping us with this, particularly people who are interested in more and more people are interested in pay equity. And so I want people to see this as an opportunity to look for the competitive advantage that they might have by working at Alaska, knowing if I work at this company, I'm going to be paid fairly because I know it's important to them versus a company that maybe doesn't post their pay ranges and also doesn't have anything in their sustainability report. They're going to be like, are they hiding something? I think you kind of mentioned that. Are they hiding
Hmm.
something? Like, why aren't they? And so
Yeah, there's some suspicion.
there's suspicion. And we
Yes.
even we even had that prior to us being transparent. That's exactly. We had a lot of mistrust with our employees, with our leaders, with our company, the black box of compensation. Nobody understood what we did. And we're now at a point, I mean, we had question after question after question, and just people hounding us on, I don't get it, I don't believe you, I don't trust you. So 5 or 6 years ago, that's where we are. And now we're at a place where because we're transparent and because we post these pay equity numbers, so what is there to not trust at this point? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so the questions from leaders they're so small now. They're so small. And we anchor almost every answer. They're like, well, I need this person and I need to pay them more. And we say, but what's really important to us is pay equity. We publish these numbers publicly. This is really important to us. And this is why we have to make this offer to this person. I know it's not exactly what you want, but our broader goal is so much
Hmm.
more important.
Yeah. Or you can take all these other people and pay them more.
Or you could do that too. Yeah, exactly.
If they're willing to, just how much do they want this person? So we
Yeah.
do have a couple of questions. I think two of them are about how to see your, what you reported, which, I mean, I think they can just go and Google your
Yep.
Alaska Airlines
Yep.
sustainability report. And actually, if you guys have the PowerPoint, I gave those four quotes. The last quote was from Alaska Airlines disclosure. So there's actually a little website information in that fourth quote. So if you just take that, that website and enter it into Google, you'll get the sustainability report.
Yeah.
And if you just search for pay equity, it'll pop right up. So
Yep.
so you can definitely see that. Um, Someone wanted to know, how did you manage collecting optional sensitive employee data to support the analysis? How did you build that trust? So, I mean, you were looking at gender and race, so you probably had those pretty well populated.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had those things pretty well populated. And so one of the things, so when it comes to data collection, a lot of the data collection is already sort of data that's collected. It's very sensitive, very confidential information, but it's already being collected. Um, we then also, and I'll just say this was quite an effort, but it felt super important to us. We went and actually collected every resume or LinkedIn profile for every employee.
Wow.
We reviewed all of them. We started with a framework of how do we consistently interpret work history, and we actually collected resumes or LinkedIn profiles from every single person and documented all of that. And so we actually have a system where we're keeping all of that information, we're aging it, and we every month update it based on new hires
Wow,
that
that's
come in
awesome.
or people who switch or change jobs. Somebody on my team updates all of that. And so we just have like, I mean, honestly, it's an Excel spreadsheet, but we keep it internally as an Excel spreadsheet
That's
to
great
make
because
sure we
most
have.
companies don't have, I mean, and that's one of the most common. I was just having a conversation with a client the other day about their discomfort with the kind of proxy for prior experience. They felt it
Mhm.
wasn't accurate. And it's like,
Yeah.
of course, using something like age as a proxy is not going to be
Yep.
accurate, but actually going to the trouble of collecting that information,
Mhm.
I mean, that's really the way to go.
We felt it was so inaccurate that level the level of importance and effort to us was worth it to collect all of that information. It took time, it took a lot of resources, a lot of people helping us do that, but it felt important enough that we should do that. So,
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions. I think those who want to stay on, maybe we can answer them. Someone wanted to know, who in the company did you find needed the most education around pay equity?
oh, that's an interesting question. Um, Interestingly enough, we I think because our culture is care and our culture is do the right thing, it actually didn't take a lot of effort to have the conversation, possibly finance, because we're a really financially responsible company. And so helping them understand why this financial investment was really important and how it aligned with our broader goals probably could have been the space that needed the most because it wasn't just buy-in to disclose. It was actually buy-in because we needed money to be able to do the
Yeah.
disclosure, right? A lot of people were like, yeah, we think disclosing is a really important thing. We actually agree with you. We understand your business case for doing this work, and that makes sense, right? So
Yeah. And then I see one other question around kind of legal complications, in terms of, how, if the work could become discoverable. So did you have any, kind of in dealing with legal to deal with those concerns?
yeah, we actually had one of our corporate counsel partner with us through a lot of the conversations that we had with Trusaic. They were there through most of our meetings just to make sure that we were talking about things, that everything was protected when it should be. Obviously, once you disclose, you are choosing to kind of open that up. But I think we did have our legal counsel partner with us through the entire process. We reviewed everything we did with them to make sure that they felt confident. Um, Sometimes this is really complicated stuff and there's a lot of data statistic jargon. And so sometimes we had to review and re-review and re-review in order for them to understand it.
Mhm.
So maybe legal was the hardest one because we really had to make sure from a legal perspective that they were comfortable with this. So,
Yeah, and that's, and the person who asked this question was saying that they've been advised by their legal team to not engage in this activity, because of
oh,
concerns. So, and I've seen the gamut. I guess
yeah,
what I would say is, and I know this is easier said than done, I feel like legal is there to support the organization in terms of the decisions it wants to make. And to basically, if you say, we would like to do this type of work and we would eventually like to disclose, how can we do this in a way
Hmm.
that legal is comfortable with,
Yes.
sort of couching it as here's what our objectives are, here's what we would like to achieve. How can you, meaning the legal team, help us achieve this in a way
Hmm.
that is protecting the company, but also allowing us to meet the objectives that we've
Yeah.
identified?
And I think asking a lot of questions, I wasn't afraid to say to legal, why are you uncomfortable with this? Why are you asking questions about this? What risk do you
Mhm.
see in this that is making you nervous, right? So asking your legal team and asking, I mean, we asked, I'm a question person. And so I asked a lot of questions because I want to understand what is their perspective? Where are they coming from? What risks are they trying to prevent? And what can we do in this work to partner together to kind of help mitigate or get to a middle ground that feels comfortable?
Yeah. And let's see, we have one less. Let's see. As a not-for-profit, do you believe disclosing is more concerning when compared to for-profit businesses? Oh, I mean, I think it's equally important. Um, I guess I don't know that I would necessarily see a difference in disclosure, although I will say I haven't seen as many nonprofit organizations disclose there. And so I don't know if there's some, again, maybe some concerns there. But, I feel like if an organization, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, really wants to do this, they know it's going to be a process. From talking with you, Heidi, they know that's not an overnight, it's a multi-year, process. So I think that's all we have time for. Heidi, I can't thank you enough for being so candid and sharing your thoughts and your process. And I think this has really helped a lot of people and helped them think through, okay, how can we be more mindful about how we disclose and what we disclose? And it's just inspirational that you guys have really gotten there.
Yeah.
And, we're just so thrilled to be partnering with you on this.
Yeah, thank you. We couldn't have done it without the help of Trusaic, that's for sure. So thank you.